Story time. Well, kind of. So, I'm on chapter 5 and 6 of Transgynecology. So, if you haven't been following along, this is a textbook for gynecologists about supporting and managing transgender patients in their practice. So, I'm guessing most people don't want to pay $100 plus to get this book, so I'm just kind of doing an overview. So this is chapter 5 and 6. So, chapter 5 is the ever-changing role of the mental health care professional in transgender healthcare. So, this chapter, on a personal note, was a little hard on my heart. That's fine. This is the reality. So, the question that they start with, I really appreciate. What can be the role of the psychotherapist, and how can a process-based interdisciplinary collaboration between the mental health care practitioner and somatic professionals be conceived in the context of transition-related healthcare? In this chapter, they use the word somatics a lot, and they're talking about body-based trans support, so primarily surgeries. They're not talking about somatics as a practice of being within our body the way that I often talk about it. So that being said, so I understand that they've got to work with the model of pathologization, and I'm so sad about it. There's no co-occurrence of disorder and non-disorder. It's sort of like it's in that box or it's not. So they do acknowledge that the label of disorder or mental health problem can add to stigmatization of trans people. However, the exclusion of gender dysphoria from diagnostic manuals could lead to more difficult access to care. So it's sort of, there's a double bind there, which I appreciate them naming. And I think it's just a, reality of the fucking psych system we've got. That's just where we are, unfortunately. So until that changes, this is not going to change. So we're working within the system we've got. So this chapter is based on that premise. So I just want to name that. They talk a lot about the mental health passage landscape of our communities. What's going on with us statistically? What are the numbers showing? What are the mental health statuses of our personage across the globe? And of course, those studies are biased to white Western culture. They name that, thankfully. But they do also talk about interventions that are more likely to be of benefit. They give case studies as well. And they really focus their interventions on the improvement of interpersonal skills, self-esteem, and social support. So these are things that within community we're often talking about, we're often supporting one another with, and certainly is a lot of the work I do in my private practice. So their focus is primarily on treatment of gender dysphoria in adults, because that's where most of the research is. So just to state that. And I love that they keep coming back to the need for continuum of care between the support work we're getting around surgeries and the psychological support that we need. And naming that mental health problems do diminish but are still common both during and after transitions, and that for all professionals, exchanging information where needed in collaboration with the client, not just for the client. They name the kind of parental establishment that can be replicated when we expect the healthcare practitioner to decide whether someone has gender dysphoria, instead of working together with the client and the patient to figure out where they want to land for themselves. So the decision-making model being very different than a clinical model that's collective with the client. So I love that. They keep coming back to that over and over. And again, that continuum of care, interdisciplinary teams. And they do note that, like, we have limited capacity. There are waiting lists that are sometimes years long. And that kind of care model is what we typically have pretty much everywhere. So how do we conceptualize of a therapeutic working alliance that is more collective? So I love that they're naming what is, and they're naming what could be possible. So what else? Oh, they call this a deliberative model, which I appreciate, where the client is determining their health-related values. And I loved seeing that so much because my work with somatic gendering is really based on an understanding of how we are aligning ourselves so that we can determine when we know if we are with our felt understandings of our gender. And so in the same way, I do a lot of values work. What are the values that you want to show up with in the ways that you are presenting in the world, and the ways that you want to present in the world? These are different, and usually the values are very similar. So I love that they named that, just because I found that my clients have really appreciated doing value work around the ways that they're coming into their sense of gender as a form of alignment for themselves. So let's see, what else? They do a lot of, like, pros and cons of the professional assessment process, and we're at different places with that. When I went in to get my assessment because I wanted to have my breasts removed, I needed a mental health care practitioner. And even though I had a psychologist and a psychiatrist within a single medical system in California, I still had to go see a separate gender specialist in order to get a letter signing off saying that I had sufficient gender dysphoria to warrant this surgery, which was just the path that I had at my avail at the time. I actually tried to get my breast taken off for my back because I'd had chronic back issues for over a decade that my medical system was, servicing me for over that time and spending a lot of money on. And I was like, if we just took these off, I really feel like much of this would go away, and it did. And my doctor was like, you're going to have better luck with that if you go through gender stuff. And I was like, well, I could do that too. So anyway, just to say, I'm intimately familiar with this expected pathway. And it comes with a lot of biases and issues. So I appreciate that they're naming that in this book. So instead, they suggest building a process-based collaboration between the client, a mental health practitioner, and they're saying somatic professionals, but it's the surgery team, right? So what else? I mean, they give a little bit of a pie in the sky, which, is nice. Physicians should be able to foster client consulting with, mental health practitioners, not for their diagnostic or assessment capability, but first and foremost to support us and our significant others to have sufficient reflective knowledge on the personal preferences and value systems that will continue to guide the decision-making process on gender-affirming interventions. Yeah, ideally, that would be beautiful. And I see that happening on the grassroots level. within community, we're doing that as best we can. And unfortunately, it's so often outside of the medical support that we're seeking and navigating. But pie in the sky is seeing those come together. So, this chapter, I don't know if you're. I think that if you have access to changing the processes by which we are getting support, then great. This chapter is very helpful and also very tiny because most OBGYNs don't. So this is a much higher level piece, but I appreciate that it is in here so that it leaves us thinking about these pieces. So that's nice. So chapter 6 is the impact of stigma and resilience on the health of transgender and non-binary people. And I love seeing resilience here because it's kind of the bedrock of the work I'm doing. It's what brought me into doing this work, and it's really what leads me through it. So one thing that's interesting throughout this book is that you have, I think it's like 50 different authors. So each chapter is uniquely crafted. So whereas chapter 5, I think they were using TGNC for trans and gender nonconforming, chapter 6 uses TNB for trans and non-binary. So different authors, different choices. And that's in the introduction. They explain all that. So just to reiterate. So this one, impacts of stigma and resilience. So going in both directions there. I wanted to go through, so they're saying that stigma and discrimination against TNB people is widespread in many levels across policy, institution, interpersonal, and intrapersonal contexts and result in profound disparities. Yes. Also that experiences of stigma are often multiple and recurring with accumulation of impact over the lifetime, and they also talk about intersectionality and those impacts. However, treatment strategies to build resilience within TNB people, within these contexts, can be protective against the impacts of stigma, including psychological distress, and that engaging in practices that minimize perpetuation of stigma and prioritize building resilience is key for healthcare providers. So that's a nice summation, and I appreciate that they go into, they start with some terminology and then some limitations of what they're going to talk about. I appreciate that kind of intro terminology, limitations prep for this particular chapter. And one thing that they note around stigma is the underlying elements that combine to generate it. And again, as I said, the intersectional pieces are laid out there. So the perpetuating systems of power over, the use of tools of shame and dehumanization, similar to the criminal system and religion, all these pieces get picked up and are such a part of the way in which stigma is built and lives within our bodies and given to us. So they talk a lot about the different places in which we experience stigma, one being public policy, specifically the criminalization of gender identity, and stigmatizing processes for the refugees and asylum seekers in particular. So as well as discriminatory laws, in the military, in healthcare, housing, education, employment, so on, and the criminalization of sex work. So these are policies that enforce stigma upon trans folks. And then post that, they talk about on the institutional levels. So gender binary and stigmatization systems within healthcare institutions, education institutions, insurance companies, and this was where we start to get into if we are trying to access HRT or access surgeries, these kind of things. And then mass incarceration and sex segregated criminals, especially, and how that affects our bodies when you have a trans person who's put into a cage, because that's what it is, with people who have, let's say, they're similar genitals but not gender, and the harmful effects of this, or not being able to access their hormones while incarcerated, these pieces. So they go into a lot of that, which is a beautiful layout of the ways in which these different things affect us. Then we move into the interpersonal, verbal, physical, sexual violence, homicide. We hear about these, well, I do on my feeds anyway, daily. Discrimination by family, housing, employment, education, healthcare, and then perceived low visual conformity. So folks who, especially in the, let's say, non-binary or in mid-transition, are not passing, as we might say. So not conforming to the gender norms. It comes with its own kind of heightened awareness in the world. I know to be true. So, and then they go into the intrapersonal. So internalized stigma leading to maladaptive coping mechanisms with negative health impacts, and the concealment of gender identity, and the avoidance or postponement of medical care, and the way that these stigmas affect us. So that is an overview of this chapter. If you want to know about one specific area, ping me, and I'm happy to do a thing just on that. The insurance companies, that's not only specific to the U.S., because we do have private insurance companies in Canada, and those definitely affect our healthcare. But they are speaking more to the United States here, which, of course, even that is drastically different state to state. So, let's see. They name that, I appreciated this within, to me, the interpersonal and the intrapersonal were big keys here, because we have more individual access to build resiliency within these two pieces. So they bring in health disparities, because that affects all of these realms, from policy into the interpersonal. So those being sexual health, chronic diseases, mental health, and then within those, specifics of depression, suicidality, substance use. So I greatly appreciate that they didn't bring in sex work as a health disparity, though they do talk about sexual preventative health and STIs. And I think they do a beautiful job of not being stigmatizing in these, which sometimes I've seen books double down accidentally. So they didn't do that here, which is beautiful. One thing that struck me, and I think it's because I have several clients who have suicidality, is they said an alarming 41% of respondents to a U.S. National Transgender Discrimination Survey reported attempting at some point in their lifetime suicide, which is compared to 4.6% of the general population. Think about that. 41% of transgender people said that they have attempted suicide at some point in their lifetime. The overall population, 4.6%. How much of that 4.6% do we make up? That was a rhetorical question. Feel free to do the math for me. But 41%, y'all. Fuck. I'm in that statistic. Yeah, definitely. So that struck me, because that's striking. That should be striking to you. If it's not, check your pulse. So, so at the end of the chapter, they go into resiliency more. And I do wish that there had been so much more here. It just feels like such a blip at the end of the chapter. Like, the first part is awareness, and I appreciate that. That's deeply helpful to be educated in these, to really have an understanding. But woo, the resilience piece is like, and blip. And so I came into this chapter really hopeful. We were going to talk about resiliency, but it's not so much. But I'm glad it's here. I'm thankful for that. So I want to see so much more, and hopefully I will later in the book. So they do describe resiliency, which I like. I like this format. It says, a personal adaptive strategy that individuals may use to buffer the effects of stress on health, involving the adaptation to risk factors and the capability of bouncing back from adversity. Resiliency also represents the individual's ability to negotiate with social contexts, generating a greater access to resources. So, I love that. I'm going to use that. I think that's beautiful. So that's from Skandura and Colleagues, 2018. I'll look that up. So they start by talking about going through the same thing. So public policy and knowing what you have control over and what you don't. And then institutional, again, knowing what you can have control over and what you don't, and supporting yourself in that. And then we get into interpersonal. And of course, the reduction in stigma-related psychological distress is reported when interpersonal factors are strengthened. So these include family support, having a supportive romantic partners, having a satisfying sex life, even that if that includes being satisfied with no sex. I'm adding that. They didn't add that here anyway. Belonging, feeling a sense of belonging within the trans and non-binary community. So a high level of peer support is more protective with lower risks of psychological distress as compared to lower moderate levels of peer support. And it's, I feel like that's a big chunk of my work with folks who are coming in to see me that are new to their transition. Is what does their support network look like? And that doesn't have to be people. Sometimes it's, the birds I watch in the morning. But when we are talking about people, what does your integration into queer, trans, non-binary community look like? Do you feel like you are mirrored in your peers? Do you feel like they have a sense of understanding? It's beautiful to have peers that are not trans or non-binary that really, can understand you as much as they're able to. They can really sympathize with what you're going to. They want to meet you there. They want to understand. That is a different support than somebody who has been through this life experience, who does understand, who can meet you where you are because they've been in similar spaces. And they also bring different contexts, and they bring different experiences, and they bring different lessons to be able to give you to those. Both of these being very important for our mental health and stability. So that's one thing I love to work with folks on, is like, how do we get you clicked into feeling held and supported by people who understand you. So that's the interpersonal. And then the intrapersonal, so building intrapersonal resiliency and promoting self-acceptance, self-worth, a sense of internal security and pride in one's gender identity, and access to and collaboration with gender-affirming behavioral health treatment resources. That's critical to building interpersonal resilience. And this is where I feel like the grassroots support within community really can help, because often we have had such challenging experiences within behavioral and mental health, with behavioral and mental health treatment, whether it's because of hospitalization or just lack of finding people who can relate to us in the field, or just not being able to access it all. So there's a variety of things there. Also, I find that within that, so many of us that are working within community to offer support are doing so at a lower cost than most of our professional peers, because we are working with folks who are lower income, have less access, are challenged to be able to pay much less access, and both of those are happening oftentimes. So many of us within community are accepting lower rates, doing pay what you can, doing solidarity offerings, not able to bring in the income that we would be making if we were working with folks who were more supported by the system, as they should be, that had more access to education and class and all the fucking things. So that means that it's kind of hard to get all boats to come up when we're all having to meet each other here. I know it's especially true for my clients who are seeking trans feminine folks who are within the psych field, and seeking especially BIPOCs who are seeking, let's say, BIPOC and queer and trans. The more of these barriers to access for those professionals to be, then the less access we have. So anyway, there's a twirl happening there. That is systemic. But just want to name that. It's not named in here. And again, I love that they brought in resilience, and it felt extremely minimal, and that makes sense within the context of this textbook. We're talking to ObGYNs, so but I would have loved to have seen more case studies on this chapter in particular. I think there is none. There's none. So chapter 6 has 0 case studies, and I think they really could have rounded out the resilience building piece had they added several case studies to each of these: the policy, institution, interpersonal. I think a case study for each of those would have made a big fucking difference. They do offer like gender affirming best practices to reduce institutional stigma in healthcare organizations, since that is the people they're talking to here. But honestly, it just felt like a bullet point from the last several chapters. So I don't know, that's something, I'll take it. But so got any questions? Okay, well, that's chapter 5 and 6. So I'm going to move on to 7 and 8, but this is still within the first section. So that will lead us, I believe, yeah. So after the next one, we'll be able to move on to practicing of transgynecology. So I'm excited about that as somebody who does post-surgical bottom scar care support. I'm looking forward to moving into that. So a lot of this has been the social setup context for how to support clients in understanding where the fuck they're coming from and how the fuck to meet us when we show up at your office. So, and what you can do to make that more smooth, so, and supportive. So, okay, that's what we've got so far. I will see y'all again later after I've gone through the next 2 chapters.